Technology.
Yeah, it's okay. Welcome to DCTV.tv from the DLD Woman 2012 in Munich. My name is Philip Banse, and my next guest is Jennifer Jacquet. She's a scientist, and she's writing a book on shame. Jennifer, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. So why are you interested in shame, or shaming as you distinguish?
So shame can be both an emotion, a noun, and a verb. So I'm interested in less how people feel and more how people act when they are threatened with shame, the idea of exposure. And I'm particularly interested in how that reacts with cooperation. So whether or not the threat of exposure for your behavior might actually change your behavior in some way to benefit the group.
Can you give us an example?
Well, in the experiments that I run in the lab, for instance, the students each receive an amount of capital that they start with, and then they can either donate some of it at each round to the group or not. And whatever is donated is doubled and redistributed evenly to all players, regardless of whether or not they donate. So
the group profits
are evenly distributed.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a privately funded park, where some people will build the park, but then everyone can enjoy it.
But and only a few pay.
And only a few might pay.
Yeah.
So the question is, could we shame people into contributing more to something like that? And the results are in, and yes, both the threat of shame as well as the promise of honor, so exposing the two most generous players, they enhance cooperation. People give more money with the idea that people will potentially see their behavior.
Are there limitations? I mean, is it a general rule? Does it apply, I don't know, on parks, on different countries, or what are the limitations of it?
Well, the really interesting thing about shame is that it's calibrated to the norm. So in this case, the norm is cooperation. But in other cases, the norm might be dental hygiene. You know, are you ashamed and so you brush your teeth in the morning? Or it could be monogamy. I mean, that's the really interesting thing about shame is people want to say, oh, that man is shameless, look at him. But in fact, he might just be operating according to a different set of norms. So shame differs across cultures, it differs across religions, differs between countries, because we all operate under different cultural norms.
But does the threat of shame have the same effect in all these norms?
No, because people, it's also calibrated to your individual perception of how people value that norm. So it's always changing. An interesting example is that taxpayers right now in the United States are being exposed online if they don't pay their taxes. In some cases, that leads to people wanting to avoid that exposure and actually paying their taxes. In other cases, people really don't mind. Again, we see that variation across individuals. Some people are shameless with that norm and others aren't. And
since, I mean, we have this, you're talking about the offline physical world, and we have shame, of course, on the internet.
Yeah.
And a phenomenon I find interesting is that people might be ashamed, although they are anonymous, and nobody really knows who they are, just their pseudonym is known, and although the physical person behind that pseudonym is totally unknown, the one who uses the pseudonym might be ashamed because he didn't act according to certain rules or certain norms.
Well, this is a big distinguishing factor between guilt and shame. So according to a very technical definition, shame does involve some sort of exposure. Now, whether or not that audience is fantasized, whether or not that audience is even God in your own mind, can lead to feeling ashamed. But maybe it's that those people are more feeling guilty for how they're behaving. The difference is sort of guilt is an internal norm that you're acting on, and shame is an external norm. You might be behaving differently because you know that the group, you might sneeze and not cover your mouth at all if you're by yourself. Now when you're with the group, you know the group values this hygiene, so you perform differently when other people are there. And that's that external norm that we all respond to.
And you mentioned the word cooperation. What exactly does it mean in your terms?
Yeah, so we tend to think of cooperation as anything where there's a tension between self-interest and group interest. So you might have an incentive to withhold money from that park that everyone's building, but you would then benefit from it, and you might even benefit more if you gave as well, because the park could be bigger or better or whatever. So cooperation is sort of any issue that has those elements. Where you would prefer to withhold, but you actually give in.
Of course, this is a topic a government, a state is very interested in parks, and there's a greater good and the personal values. And what can governments learn from your research when they're trying to enhance greater goods and public goods? Should they expose those who are not acting according to these rules? Is that a recipe?
Yeah. So the talk I gave today was about the Scarlet Internet and the notion of the Scarlet Letter, where we got rid of that level of state shaming. We actually became very uncomfortable with the idea that the state would get involved and actually invite the public in on the punishment.
Which is a medieval practice.
Exactly, and people felt uncomfortable with that for all sorts of very good reasons. But with the digital era, we do see the problems of shame being transformed quite a bit. And that one of the elements that people were really uncomfortable with was feeling that any sort of scarlet letter on you undermined your human dignity, that you shouldn't have to wear pink uniforms in prison for behaving a certain way. You shouldn't have to have a scarlet A on you. You shouldn't have to hold up a sign. Even though these things still do exist today, they're much smaller than they used to be in those medieval times. But now with the internet, people are becoming more comfortable with the idea that you would publish sex offenders and their photographs online, non-taxpayers, and it's different for every issue where people's comfort lies.
But why do people differentiate? I mean, what's the difference between exposing a taxpayer physically on a marketplace, like it was done in Europe in I don't know, 15th century, and putting his photo, address, birth date on the internet, searchable globally?
Yeah, it's very curious. I mean, we found a very strong effect that people found that online shaming far more acceptable than that physical. And I think there's a spectrum that ranges from very physical, like a tattoo or an actual brand, to the sign carrying, down to your photograph being online. People are less comfortable with that, I suspect, than just your name. And I think also that it's because we're in a very nascent phase of the internet still, where I think in 20 years those values might change, and people might see that in the same way that they do the Scarlet A.
And which effect? I mean, you were talking about shame on the one hand, and honor on the other hand. So publishing those who gave the most money.
Yes.
And which of these effects is more effective?
So they're both equally strong according to our results, but there are some nuances that are important in both. For instance, the honored players, we had them keep playing after they'd been exposed in both cases, and the honored players gave as much, if not more, than they had been giving. In other words, they lived up to that honorable reputation.
Yeah.
And the shame players almost dropped out completely, said, hey, look at me, I've been shamed, I'm going to keep defecting in this game.
No matter if I pay more, I've been ashamed once, so and I couldn't do anything about it, no point in.
So the question is whether or not it might not reintegrate people into society. Shaming might be ostracizing, you know, and you might reinforce that sort of bad behavior.
So you would argue, in terms of government acting more to honor people and publicize good deeds than criticize?
That's the instinct for people to say that. But on the other hand, when you look at certain cooperation issues like climate change, it has this collective risk element, right? Where it's not just a matter of building a park, whether or not the park is small or big. You're talking win or lose. And the people who are, or the entities who are not cooperating concern us most.
Yeah.
And without them, we can't win this game.
Okay.
So then the option of honor is sort of off the table because there are few nations who are ruining it for everyone else, and honor is not going to change that.
And Europeans usually try to shame the US because they're not acting, they're not doing enough to lower their carbon dioxide emissions. Why doesn't it work?
I don't have the data to explain, but I have a few instinctual reactions. One is, for instance, Obama, when he first took office, he used the word shame twice about banker bonuses and related to basically the Wall Street issue. And since then, he has not used the word. Now, I think that's because his approval ratings have fallen. And shame depends very much also on its source. And so you cannot imagine Bill Clinton saying, you should be ashamed of yourselves. He couldn't even use the word. And so in this case, I think that because the US, for whatever reason, thinks that it's in charge, it doesn't necessarily respect the source enough. So I would recommend, getting tougher on that country. Make them respect you,
Okay, and how would we do that?
Well, you would know better than I would, but we used to have more, with global politics, we used to have more opportunities for what they would call shaming tariffs, for instance. When there was a global ban on, or there was an attempted global ban on drift netting in the high seas, which was killing lots of marine life, the US led a shame tariff against Taiwan and the other nations doing this. So they put a tariff on their electronic goods and said until you, but now with global politics, it's made those options less
available.
Possible.
Yeah. Where can we find your research? Where should we go when people are interested in learning more about it?
Well, I have a book chapter out now, and I have a book to come next year that will be published with Fisher in Germany.
In German as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. Jennifer, thank you very much for your coming, for your time.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Thanks.